Before we begin this story, let me explain an important concept from Japanese folklore. In traditional Japanese belief, there exists something called a reidō or spirit path, invisible pathways, that spirits of the deceased use to travel to the afterlife. These paths often pass through homes and buildings, and rooms located on these paths can become focal points for supernatural encounters. Japanese homes traditionally have specific architectural considerations for spiritual protection, including the placement of Buddhist altars and protective charms called omamori. The concept of spirits being unable to rest properly, especially those who died in hospitals or away from home, is deeply rooted in Japanese spiritual beliefs about the importance of proper death rituals and ancestor veneration. Now let our story begin. I live in a remote mountain village in the Japanese countryside. This is a story from when I was a child. When you're in the early grades of elementary school, it's normal to sleep with your parents. But as you get older and reach the higher grades, you naturally start wanting your own room. One day, I approached my mother with a request. I want my own room just like my older brother and sister have. At that time there was an empty corner room on the second floor, so I asked if I could have it. There were 3 rooms upstairs, but the other 2 were already occupied by my siblings. However, to my surprise, my mother refused with an unusually strong tone. No, absolutely not. That room had excellent sunlight and was one of the best rooms in the house. Yet, the wooden shutters were always kept closed and it was being used as a storage room. But there wasn't much stored there anyway. We had a large storage shed in the garden, and that's where we usually kept things. The room was truly unused. This seemed strange to me as a child. It felt unreasonable that I couldn't have my own room when such a room was sitting empty. So I kept pestering her about it, but my mother remained firmly opposed, showing no signs of giving in. Finally, I decided to change tactics and ask my father instead. My father was stubborn and strict, a scary person to a child like me. I didn't really want to ask him for favors, but I wanted my own room that badly. Looking back now, I think I might have become stubborn as a child, because the room I thought would be easy to get was met with such unexpected fierce opposition. When I asked my father after he returned from the town hall, he gave permission surprisingly easily. I had been prepared to be yelled at. My heart was pounding so hard. I was so taken aback that I just stood there in a daze for a while. "What's wrong? Aren't you happy?" It was only my father's words that finally brought me back to my senses. However, my mother, who had been listening from behind, came rushing over with a look of panic on her face. "Dear, absolutely not. Not that room, never. Do you not care what happens to Michael?" I was already surprised that my usually gentle mother had been so adamantly opposed from the beginning, but I was even more shocked to see her directly oppose my father's decision. I was so surprised that I couldn't even think about the strange reason for my mother's opposition. My father stubbed out his cigarette and said, "Are you still going on about that? That room is one of the best rooms in this house. It's such a waste to leave it like that forever. I listened to your opinion back then, but enough is enough. What parent would hinder their son's growing independence?" With my father's stern rebuke, my mother reluctantly gave in, though she looked more anxious than dissatisfied. My mother's strange behavior bothered me a little, but I was so happy about getting the room that I stopped caring about such things. The next weekend, my father and siblings helped move the items from the second floor room to the storage shed and cleaned it up. My room was complete, even though it only had a study desk. My mother still looked gloomy, but my father, who had always seemed scary to me, worked cheerfully to make up for my mother's darkness. Seeing him smile at me while covered in sweat made him seem incredibly dependable. On my first night sleeping alone, my mother came to me secretly, trying not to be noticed by the family. She entered my room and seemed about to say something, but she appeared troubled and couldn't bring herself to speak. I had been harboring some hostile feelings toward my mother since she opposed my having the room, so I said rather harshly, "What is it?" My mother's body trembled, and she apologized. "I'm sorry, this room belongs to Michael now, and I won't oppose it anymore. But please, I want you to remember just this one thing. If anything happens in this room, grip this tightly and chant, Namo Amida Putsu." She handed me a rather unusual protective charm. I had no idea what she was talking about and didn't know how to respond. My mother simply said, "Don't forget," and left the room. Her serious gaze frightened me more than what she said. I stared at the ceiling thinking about it for a while, but eventually fell asleep. Nothing happened that night. In the next morning, my mother had returned to her usual gentle self. Several days passed. I became absorbed in moving furniture into the room to make it look proper, and my mother helped me with this, so I completely forgot about that incident. However, when there was a funeral at a house on the outskirts of the village, my mother's behavior became a bit strange again. But strange only meant that she would occasionally look at me with concern. The person who had died was an elderly woman, who often talked with my mother, so I thought that might be the cause and didn't pay much attention to it. But then, several days after the funeral, something happened. I was sleeping when some strange noise woke me up. Our house faces the road that leads down to town, and cars occasionally pass by even in the middle of the night from the town beyond the mountains. I thought it might be a car and looked toward the window. Indeed, a car seemed to be approaching, as the curtains were brightly lit up, but I could see what looked like a shadow reflected there. I thought it was the shadow of a tree outside the house and initially didn't pay attention to it. Oh, just a car. I tried to go back to sleep, but I felt something was wrong. I had been looking at the window for about 4 or 5 seconds, but usually when car headlights illuminate the area, it's only for an instant. There was no reason for the illumination to continue while I was watching. I wondered if a car had stopped outside, but there was nothing here worth stopping for, and it would be strange for a car to stop in a position where it would light up my room. That spot was right at a curve in the road. On one side was a steep slope down to a ravine, and on the other side was only a concrete wall covering the cliff, with just farmland above that wall. What would anyone be doing by stopping their car in such a place? Had some emergency occurred somewhere? Such anxiety made me wide awake. I got up and looked at the window again. It was still brightly lit as if illuminated by headlights. But looking carefully, it wasn't car headlights at all. It was some kind of strange bluish light. Today you might think of LED lights, but in those days such things didn't exist. Car headlights were all whitish yellow light. And the shadow reflected there wasn't from a tree either, because while the light remained stationary, only the shadow was moving closer to me. Even if it swayed in the wind, it shouldn't move like that, and it was gradually beginning to look like the shape of a person. It was at this point that I first began to feel fear. As a child I must have sensed that something very bad was happening. I panicked and ran out of the room, rushing to my parents. My parents were asleep, but they woke up when I came in. My mother asked with concern, "What happened?" I started to tell her what had just occurred, but then said, "Nothing, I just got lonely sleeping by myself." I said this because I thought if I made a fuss, they might take away my precious room. My father seemed a bit exasperated and laughed. "Michael is still just a child after all." He let me into their bed. My mother didn't seem to believe me at all, and looked at me with concern, but I ignored her and clung to my father as I slept. From that night on, nothing happened again for days. At first I was a bit scared, but since nothing occurred I began to forget about it. Then, another person in the village died. This time it was a neighbor, an uncle who used to play with me when I was very small. He had been hospitalized with illness, and passed away without recovering. Several days after his funeral, it finally happened. Again I seemed to hear some noise and woke up in the middle of the night. However, that day I had been playing with friends in the mountains behind our house, and was late getting up, so when I looked at the window, the shadow was more clearly human-shaped than before, reflected on the curtain. I tried to run away again, but the shadow seemed to be right outside the window now. The shadow of a person walking while ringing a bell looked like it might enter the room at any moment, and I was too frightened to move. I could clearly hear the sound of the bell. and finally it entered the room. The moment that shadow entered the room, the light that had been illuminating the curtain also came inside, creating a circular tunnel of light that enveloped me as well. And through that tunnel came the uncle who was supposed to be dead, ringing his bell. Our eyes met. The uncle said, "Hey there, Michael. Long time no see." But his eyes were vacant with no life in them, and his skin was so unnaturally white, that in the light it appeared bluish white, and looked terrifyingly abnormal. I was so scared I couldn't say anything and just stared at him. "What's wrong? Why are you making such a frightened face? You always greeted me cheerfully before, didn't you? Did something happen?" He asked me this. I was scared to death, but since he didn't seem likely to harm me, I managed to squeeze out my voice and somehow answered, "Good evening." Looking back now, it was a ridiculous response, but that was all I could manage. "Michael, do you know where my wife is? I've been looking for her but I can't find her." He was referring to his wife. I heard later that she had gone to a relative's house that night. Of course I had no way of knowing this, so I shook my head. "I see you don't know," the uncle answered with his unfocused eyes and thought for a while. But then, as if he had thought of something wonderful, he broke into a very, very happy smile. That smile was truly joyful, but to me it looked terrifyingly frightening. It was a fear that numbed all my senses. Then the uncle said, "Michael, let's go together." "Yes, that's it. That's perfect." Chuckling to himself, he approached me. I was a mess of tears and snot, but I couldn't do anything and couldn't move until the uncle grabbed my arm. However, the moment the uncle grasped my arm, an intense shock ran through me, as if every cell in my body was screaming, like electricity coursing through me. I instinctively shook off his arm and crawled toward my study desk to escape. The uncle looked a bit surprised and said, "What's wrong, Michael? I'm saying I'll take you to a nice place." The uncle said this while approaching me with that same smile. I was running my mind at full speed to escape this situation, but I was also panicking, so my thoughts wouldn't come together. To escape to the hallway, I would have to get past the uncle, but there was no way I could do that. The uncle was getting closer and closer. Just when I thought it was hopeless, I finally remembered what my mother had told me. That protective charm should still be in my desk drawer where I had put it that day. Remembering this, I quickly reached for the charm, but the uncle grabbed my shoulder. Again, a shock ran through my entire body and I began to lose consciousness. When the sliding door to the hallway opened, standing there was my mother. She was holding the same kind of protective charm she had given me, and she shouted at the uncle, "I will not allow you to take that child." She approached me and the uncle while chanting sutras. The uncle backed away from me as if afraid of the charm. "Where you belong is over there. Go by yourself." She shouted this and began chanting sutras again. "You don't have to be so angry." The uncle said this sadly, and began walking toward the hallway where the tunnel continued. Just as he was about to disappear into the wall, screams came from the hallway. It was my brother and sister's voices. My mother stopped chanting for a moment, but since the uncle's movement also stopped at that instant, she continued chanting sutras. When the uncle completely disappeared into the wall and the light tunnel vanished, she stopped chanting for the first time and collapsed on the spot as if exhausted. Even though it was a winter night, she was drenched in sweat, with steam rising from her entire body. However, when my brother and sister came into my room saying, "What was that just now? A person went into the wall," my mother suddenly stood up and began crying while holding all of us. I was crying loudly too. My brother and sister must have looked confused. Finally, my father woke up from all the commotion. "Dear, this room really is no good." Michael was almost taken away. When my mother appealed to him like this, my father fell silent with a troubled expression. "Dear, still can't you believe what I'm saying? Do you think I'm sick?" My mother desperately pleaded with him, but my father still looked troubled. "Even with this, you still can't believe it." Saying this, my mother took off my pajama top and showed my father my arm and shoulder. It was only then that I noticed for the first time that where the uncle had grabbed my arm and shoulder, there were blue bruises in the shape of a hand. "This can't be." My father said this and sat down on the spot. My brother and sister also looked and were frightened. "So what you were saying was really true." Having said this, he became dazed. My mother approached my father and said, "I told you many times, didn't I? This is a spirit path. If we don't do something about it, this room is dangerous." We children didn't understand what a spirit path meant, but my father nodded repeatedly. From the next day my father moved quickly. He went to consult with the oldest person in the village, had them introduce him to a Buddhist monk, picked him up by car, and had him examine the situation immediately. Then, following the monk's instructions, we built a small shrine in the garden, but it was unusual. Instead of having a Buddha statue in the place where one would normally go, there was nothing there, and there were slots for storing protective papers on both side walls, with doors on both the front and back, just like the front entrance. It was like a shrine that could be entered from both front and back, like an elevator. Then, we embedded stones carved with strange patterns in the ground like road markers, creating a route that went around the house, and built the same kind of shrine behind the house as well. Now the spirits will go around the house instead of through it. You can rest easy now, the monk said. Indeed, nothing happened after that. Whenever someone in the village died, for several days our entire family would sleep in my room like we were keeping watch. In other words, we experimented, though everyone except my father hated it. However, my father had apparently spent a considerable amount of money on the shrines and the monks' purification fees, so he insisted, "I won't be satisfied unless we test whether it's effective." He forced us to go along with it. It's a strange story, isn't it? But it was very much like my father. However, as expected, that room became vacant again. I never wanted to experience something like that again. My father had no choice but to tear down the storage shed and build a separate room there for my brother, and my brother's room became mine. In the corner room on the second floor became a perfect storage room. My father grumbled about it constantly, but since all the other family members insisted on it, he had to give in. When my mother first came to this house as a bride, they rebuilt the house for the occasion, and that corner room was their bedroom. However, my mother, who had strong spiritual sensitivity, spent sleepless nights every time spirits passed through and was beginning to develop mild neurosis, so they moved to a room downstairs. In the same kind of bruises that appeared on my body, had also appeared on my mother's body before. At that time, my father had assumed that my mother had made them herself, but seeing them on my body too, and with my siblings as witnesses, my father finally believed. In the end, we built 2 shrines just for a storage room, and there were purification fees, annual costs for protective papers, and having sutras chanted every 2 years, which meant picking up the monk by car. I feel sorry for what we put my father through now. The spirit of the uncle I encountered had apparently become somewhat mentally ill during his long hospitalization, and due to loneliness, he tried to take someone with him. He was a rather malicious spirit. Most just passed through, my mother told me. However, my mother says that spirits of those who died in accidents or suicide are truly frightening. They want to create companions indiscriminately. So even now, my parents and my brother's family still live in my childhood home, but the corner room on the second floor remains a storage room, and the shrines are still there. Everyone, if you ever encounter a spirit path, please just run away. Spirits traveling through spirit paths cannot leave the path. So whatever you do, never run in the direction the spirit path is heading. That much, you absolutely must not. Wait, right now, behind me, I hear the sound of a bell.